What's going on, everyone? My name's Eric, and today on the channel I have the pleasure and the privilege of showing you this wonderful stack of amps here. This is pretty much like Dimebag Tone Mountain, if you will. We got some Randalls, we got some Cranks, we got a mini Warhead up here. These are pretty much all of the amps that Dimebag used for the most part through his musical career of Pantera and Damageplan. We're sort of missing one or two amps here, but we're going to talk about that later. Otherwise, this is pretty much it. These are like the staples of the Tone for the most part here. I want to give a huge shout out to my buddy Ryan Day. He has loaned me a couple of these amps from his collection so I can make this happen. Thanks, buddy. I really appreciate you doing that. So we're going to go down memory lane. We're going to plug into all of these amps. We're going to try and get some tones. I'm going to give you my thoughts and opinions on these amps and kind of in the relation to like the album tones, the live tones, and things like that. And ultimately, we're just gonna have fun and celebrate the legacy of Dime, which is something that we normally do on this channel. Let's get started. We're gonna start with the Randall RG HT100. So now before we go any further, there's a couple things I want to clarify with how I went about tone chasing and getting some of the guitar tones that we're gonna be hearing in today's video. So when I was doing my homework and chasing down some of these tones and trying to get as close as I could to a lot of these guitar tones, I was using a couple different sources. I was using the original album guitar tone, some of the remastered guitar tones as well from like the 25th anniversary albums. I also went down the YouTube rabbit hole of trying to find isolated guitars outside of the mix, and I was also going down to watching a lot of the live footage as well. When we listened to those Pantera albums, we got to remember that Dimebag's rig was in the studio, it was mic'd up, and those mics are going into EQs, compressors. It's going to have to sit a certain way because it has to fit into a full mix. So the tone that's going to work on the album to fit with the drums, the bass, and the vocals, and anything else, it might be a little bit different than what you're hearing in the live room. And of course, when all of that music is then mixed and mastered and compressed down to MP3s or WAV files, or it's, done up to tape, it's going to change a little bit from the original source. So keep that in mind. Another thing too, going down the YouTube rabbit hole, watching all of the old videos from like the 90s, all of those videos capturing audio either from the board or either like just from like the old VHS handheld recorders, that's capturing it a certain way as well. And I'm listening to it on headphones, I'm listening to it with my studio monitors and everything like that. So I'm hearing it as a certain way as well. And you might be hearing it a little bit differently as well. There are so many variables to consider with this, but what I really want to drive home is that if you are having fun and if you're chasing down this gear and you're still having fun, chasing some tones and everything like that, you're playing your favorite riffs, like that's the most important thing at the end of the day. Although what I hear on my headphones, my studio monitors, and like with my own ears and my own room and everything like that, it might be a little bit different from what you are hearing as well. And especially if you are trying to get those Dimebag guitar tones, there are many variables to consider when you are chasing the tone. All right, now this is where Dimebag's tone pretty much started. This is the Randall RG series amplifier. This one came in a couple different configurations. We had the Randall RG100 Classic. There's the RG100, 150, 170. We have the Randall RG100 ES, which is what Dimebag pretty well used, and we have the 100 HT, which is essentially a rack mount version of the 100 ES. Now the 100 ES and the HT were pretty well Dimebag's amp of choice for the early glam days and for the very first album, Pantera's Cowboys from Hell. This one in particular, the 100 HT, this was used on a lot of the fly rigs and especially that Monsters of Moscow show. All of the Randalls that we're going to be covering today have a really neat feature, which is like the inherent design and the tonal characteristics. Randall was really proud on saying that their amplifiers had like this tube amplifier warmth, but it had the simplicity of solid state amplifiers. And the big reason why Dimebag used these Randall solid state amplifiers is because they naturally just sounded better to him and they sounded more at home for him. Even though there were a lot of great options for tube amps back in the day, and especially in the 90s, like when the 5150 came out, Dimebag still preferred these ones because all of the bands that he grew up listening to, like AC/DC, ZZ Top, they all use tube amps, and that was his frame of reference for tube amps and the sounds that they can get. And with that mindset, that led him to these solid state amplifiers, which just kind of had that tube amp warmth, and they were a little bit easier to live with, and they might have been just a little bit easier to dial in, and they just sounded maybe a little bit better right out of the box. So now Dime didn't just plug straight into this amp for his Pantera tone. There was a bunch of other effects, but some of the key ones that he used to get his signature sound was the MXR 6-band equalizer, and he used a Furman parametric equalizer. Both of those were able to shape the tone a little bit more going into the amp and also give it a little bit more gain and kind of give it that boosted sound, and that's essentially the Dimebag tone for the most part, mixed with those Randall Jaguar speakers. So I have a modern version of the MXR 6-band and I have a PQ3 clone. I'm going to use both of those with a noise gate and this Randall RG100 here. Going to play some Pantera riffs from the Cowboys era, going to run it through some Randall Jaguar speakers, and we're just going to have some fun with it and just kind of give you an idea of where Dimebag's tone started and just to see how it's going to evolve throughout the years. Now at this point, Dime has been using the Randall RG series amps for a good amount of time. That amp was used throughout the Pantera glam era, and it was used right up until 1992, or at least the beginning of the Vulgar display of power writing and recording sessions. At this point, Dime went and switched over his amps to something that had a little bit more power than that outgoing Randall RG series. We now have the Randall Century series amplifiers. And just as the Randall RG series, the Randall Century came in a couple different variations. This one here is the Century 2. There's also the Century 1. There's a couple other variations of the Century. If you want to see a dedicated video on the Randall Century 2 and the Century 1 respectively, I got videos on my channel where you can check those out and you can learn a little bit more about the features in more depth than we're going to cover right now. But for the most part, these amplifiers were naturally louder. These ones were around 150 to 200 watts by comparison to the 70 to 120-ish watts of those Randall RG amplifiers. This amp also came with a couple different bells and whistles, which also added to Dimebag's tone as well. A big one on these Randall Century amps is going to be the sustain boost. Essentially what that does is turns the mids down a little bit, adds gain, drops the volume a little bit more, and pushes the amp harder, and almost seems like you're having like an overdrive pedal kind of pre-built into the amp. So with more gain on tap, you think maybe Dimebag would have ditched one of the pedals because you don't need that anymore, and you'd be wrong, because Dimebag pretty well kept the exact same rig for the most part, just cycled through some different amps. He did use a different amp for cleans at one point, but the distortion tones, which is again what we're chasing here, is all Randall Century. Now with the Randall Century amps on Vulgar display of power, they still have that very iconic scoop sound. So I'm going to pair up the Randall Century 2 with the MXR 6 band, with the Master Effect Parametric 4 band equalizer, and with a noise gate as well, and just to get that Vulgar display of power tone and just, you know, have some fun and chase Dime's tone. So just after Vulgar display of power, we enter the Far Beyond Driven era, which is what a lot of people regard as Pantera's #1 album, like their favorite album, the best album. It's also Pantera's #1 album because it was #1 on the Billboard 200 in '94 for like a couple weeks as far as I know, and that's something that was pretty well unheard of at the time, and the tones for that are this guy right here. The rig pretty well stayed the same for the Far Beyond Driven tour cycle, and for the recording session, we still had the MXR 6 band, and we had the Furman PQ4 parametric equalizer just pushing this amp even more. Had a noise gate as well to keep it all quiet, but the rig pretty well didn't change. Maybe a couple different variations between the Century 1 and the Century 2. Both of those amps sound pretty much the same. The only differences are a couple small bells and whistles and maybe some small EQ curves that are very negligible at the end of the day. But one thing that I want to highlight when I was doing this whole video and listening to a lot of the isolated guitar parts and listening to live footage is that it seemed like the guitar tone on Far Beyond Driven had much more mids than it did in the Vulgar display of power and Cowboys from Hell respectively. So for this section, I've dialed up the mids a little bit more just so they cut a little bit more and there's a little less of that scoop mid sound, because that's what I'm hearing in my studio on my reference monitors and my headphones when I listen to the songs and when I isolate the guitar and all those things. So we're going to add a little bit more mids, otherwise the rig is going to stay the exact same. I'm going to show you the settings on screen as I've done in the past. Jaguar speakers, let's get into it. So now we're out of the Far Beyond Driven album and touring cycle, and at this point, Pantera goes back into the studio and writes and releases probably one of my favorite albums out of their entire catalog, which is the Great Southern Trendkill. That's one of my favorite albums. I love the songs on it. Some of the guitar solos are the best that have just stood the test of time. You got Tens, you got Floods, some of the best that's out there. You got the alternate tunings with Sandblasted Skin and Underground in America. Some really interesting song structures, a little bit more sampling. It's very interesting. And it's a very, very unique album, and it's just so different than anything that Pantera has done at this point. Another interesting thing about the album, and like specifically like the amps and the guitars that we're talking about, is that Dimebag went backwards for his rig. He ended up going back to the rig that he used in the Cowboys from Hell era and the Glam era, which was the Randall RGs with the Furman PQ3 and the MXR 6-band. So you think Dimebag would have like evolved to something different, but you know, he changed it up and went backwards because maybe that was the sound he was chasing. So yeah, bring back this guy and bring back that iconic 3-band parametric equalizer, bring back the 6-band, and we got those old tones coming back in probably the most experimental Pantera album that's ever been released. Even plugging into the Randall RG like I got like right below me right here, it's just pure Great Southern Trendkill right away. This with the Jaguar speakers and a couple other bells and whistles, and it's right there. And it's just so fun to plug in those pedals with this amp and just play along to some of my favorite songs out of the Pantera catalog. So let's just go do that. So as we leave the Great Southern Trendkill, we have a live album, and at that point there's a lot of people speculating, is Pantera going to release another album? There was no talks of it because Pantera was just touring and touring and touring, and there was no real talks of like the band going into the studio or even writing or anything like that. But they managed to come back together and write the final album, which was Reinventing the Steel. Now within this time, Dimebag was also developing a signature amplifier, which was the Randall Warhead. And a lot of people online from my readings in the forums, they were thinking that Dimebag used this amp for Reinventing the Steel. And that's actually not the case. And even though there was a ton of promo for the Randall Warhead and Reinventing the Steel, Dime never used it on the album, and Dime never used it live outside of cleans. Apparently Dime was not a fan of the amp when he actually integrated it into the rig or just in general, but he used it for cleans. It was 300 watts, tons of headroom, so it's not going to break up. It can have a really pristine clean sound, but all of the distorted tones were, again, the Randall RG, just as we see here. And that was mixed again with the MXR 6-band and the Furman PQ3. Again, the Cowboys from Hell rig stood the test of time for another album. And I will link to an interview with Sterling Winfield, who was Rex's bass tech and who actually worked on producing Reinventing the Steel. He said the entire album was done with a Randall RG, with an MXR 6-band, a Furman PQ3, SM58 on the Jaguars, and that's pretty much it outside of the other bells and whistles that you hear on the album. The original release of the album doesn't have my favorite Pantera guitar tones or Dimebag guitar tones in general. The remastered version by Terry Date has some really good updated guitar tones, and I'm also referencing a lot of live footage as well, so I'm kind of getting the best of both worlds with that, and honestly his live tone in that era sounded way better than the original pressing of the album, so that's kind of what I'm going towards with this one here. But I guess if we've learned anything thus far with Dimebag's like gear, it's like if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and that's kind of what they did on the Reinventing the Steel album. after Pantera stops touring and stops playing shows, Dime and Vinny end up starting a new project called Damageplan. And for this new project, Dime wants to reinvent his tone. He wants to do something totally different so it doesn't sound like Pantera. And if you didn't know, this was actually supposed to be Dimebag's solo project, and he ended up just putting a full band together with his brother and a couple other buddies. So speaking of the guitar tone, Dime went back to the drawing board with Randall, and they ended up making the Randall Warhead X2. And that was the amp that was used on the Damageplan album Newfound Power in conjunction with Randall isolation cabinets, which have those Celestine V30s in it. And that information came right from Dime in the March 2004 Guitar World, which has like King Dime Returns on it. He talks about his rig and everything, and that's apparently it. He didn't really mention like Furman PQ3s or MXR 6 bands or anything like that. I'm assuming there would be a little bit of extra push in the front end from one of those units, but he didn't really mention that in the interview. If you know of any other changes to the rig at that point, let me know down below, but that's right from the source himself. And I would show you all what the Randall Warhead or the X2 sounds like, but I don't have access to those right now, and they don't really pop up in the used market, which makes it hard. I do have a pedal called the ICBM, which is from Ghost Note Audio. From what I've read, that preamp pedal is a clone of the preamp section of the Randall X2 Warhead. Some of my friends who have the Randall Warhead X2 have said that it's a direct comparison, it's a direct clone. Even when I plugged that pedal in and boosted it with another pedal and ran it with a noise gate and tried it in a couple different configurations with V30s, as Dime said he did on the Damageplan album, it wasn't giving me the results that I was really looking for. So I want to do a dedicated section of the Warhead when I get my hands on one at some point. If you're in Canada, if you have one, if you want to send it over, let me know. Let's work something out, because I would love to get a Warhead or a Warhead X2 on the channel. Now, if we're talking Damageplan tone, and I've demoed it in the past, like every time I think of Dimebag's tone with Damageplan, I immediately go right to the cranks. I go to the crank Rev, the crank Frankenstein, and I go to those Eminence Texas Heats and those Eminence Legends in the big oversized crank caps. Every time I put that combination together, it's just the Dimebag sound from Damageplan, and it sounds so good in that context, and it sounds so great in other contexts as well. And interestingly enough, those crank amps, if you don't know, they are tube amps, which is a far cry from what we've seen so far in solid state amp land. So it's interesting to see how people's ears can change and people can actually try something different for once as well. So we got a crank amp here. We got the crank Frankenstein. This is one of my favorite amps. Dimebag tone aside, like, it's such a unique sounding amp. It's all tube. You put an overdrive in front of this thing and it sounds so cool. You got the sweep knob on it, which really voices the mid-range as well. This amp has a couple other sweet bells and whistles, and this one came after Dimebag passed, although he was designing this with crank right before his untimely passing. This amp is very similar to the crank amp that he used, which was the Revision 1, and there's only a couple differences between these two. I think there's something on the board that might be a little bit different, but otherwise they're pretty much the same thing. This one just looks a little bit cooler because there's a bunch of green accents and there's a bunch of threes and Dime's, you know, signature on the thing. Like, it just looks a little bit cooler and a little bit more menacing than the regular Revision 1. And at this point as well, Dimebag's rig pretty much changed. He had a couple rack units in the back. I remember seeing pictures of like his rolling rack. It maybe had like a couple Furmans in there. I don't think he really used them. They might have been there just to kind of hold some space, because otherwise every time we've seen like a rig rundown from 2004 when he started using cranks, it was just a couple MXR pedals up front. We had a wah, we had the Zakk Wylde overdrive and a noise gate, and it went right into this amp here. You can't go wrong with that, just throwing an overdrive in front of a tube amp and you can get a wicked metal sound. So let's just do that right now. So at this point, I'm pretty sure we all know where the timeline is going. It was only just a couple months after Dime joined with Crank and rejoined with Dean Guitars and Dean Zielinski that he was unfortunately taken from us so tragically. And after that, there was a bit of an outpouring of gear that was just tributes to the man and his legacy. You know, we saw a lot of the Dean signature guitars, and then we saw a Dime signature amp from Dean Guitars, and that was modeled after the Randall RG100, and it had a couple other bells and whistles that kind of kicked it up a couple notches as well. We then also saw the Frankenstein version 2. That one was a little bit different than the original one, and you don't really see those ones on the market that often. But unfortunately, the Dean amp eventually became discontinued, and crank amps eventually went out of business, unfortunately, and the only thing left to hold Dimebag's legacy was Dean Guitars, and as we have seen in the last couple of years, that is no longer a thing. The only thing that we really have right now in terms of amplifiers that are really carrying the Dimebag name is the new Warhead Mini amp. So this amp came to fruition thanks to three main people. We have Dave Karen, we have Grady Champion, and Rita Haney. Rita Haney is Dimebag's longtime girlfriend. She runs the estate. Grady Champion, he is Dimebag's longtime guitar tech. He knows the rig inside and out, currently with Pantera on the road. So Dave took the Randall Warhead and the Warhead X2 and kind of redesigned them and reimagined them and put it into like this smaller 40-watt, much more manageable, much more affordable lunchbox platform, which honestly keeps up with any sort of amp, especially with monitors, cabinets, miking it up, and PA systems. Like, you can do a lot with this amp, believe it or not, even though it is only 40 watts, Class D. Still solid state goodness, nothing to really go wrong. This thing's awesome, and I have a dedicated video on the channel for this, and I've been having so much fun with this amp. It's just like the Dimebag sound for the most part in a box. You pair it with the right speakers like the Jaguars, you're gonna get some Pantera tones. You pair it with those Eminence Legends, you're gonna get some Damageplan tones. And this is a great way to keep the legacy alive because this is designed like with the family and with people who worked so closely with Dime when he was still with us. Now moving forward, it's hard to say what's really going to happen with the line of Dimebag guitars that's supposed to be coming out and the new like Warhead amps. Like, we only have this and a cabinet, so we just got to wait and see what's going to be coming down the pipeline. I think there's a few other things, and I wouldn't be surprised if there is going to be maybe a new like plugin that comes, because there is that Amplitude plugin, which there hasn't been a lot of talk about, so I'm assuming there's going to be something new in that realm soon. But you know, we just got to wait and see. But at the end of the day, like, there are so many different ways to chase Dimebag's tone, whether you're chasing it on the old Randall solid states, the cranks, or you're getting it with the new Warhead, or even with the new plugins, and however way you might be getting it, maybe like with stomp boxes like I've shown on the channel here. This is kind of the evolution of Dimebag's tone, and it's just so sweet that we can get it in so many different options at this point in time. And that's going to do it for today's video, kind of checking out Dimebag, tone, amp, mountain, whatever you want to call it. Once again, thanks to my buddy Ryan Dave, who provided some of these amps to make this video happen. Really appreciate it. Once again, it's like not every day you see all of these wicked amps like in front of you here, so, you know, young me getting into guitar and Pantera Dimebag is just like, you know, coming full circle right around here. If you like this video, make sure you hit the like button, leave a comment down below. Let me know your favorite amp out of this collection here or out of the other amps that Dime used throughout his career. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. I have tons more videos going down Dimebag and Pantera rabbit holes and other guitar related topics. And if you are a returning subscriber, make sure you hit the bell so you don't miss a single video that I upload. Thanks for checking this out, and I'll see you next time.